board. It's Thursday the 14th. It's a little bit after 9. And I want to get started probably mostly because I'm not exactly sure how long this will take, because I have compiled a number of different resources that I kind of want to go over with you guys, and then I'll email out like I had done with some of the stress management handouts and nutritional handouts that I've done in the past, because some things have been updated, which is really neat. And there's just a lot of stuff for me to share with you today. And so I am going to start by sharing my screen. For those of you that haven't seen the dashboard from the Alaska Department of Health and Human Services, we don't have, we had no new cases yesterday. So we're holding fairly stable, but here's, this is part of the Alaska Department of Health and Human Services epidemiologic page. And we've talked a lot about testing in the past, and so I wanted to review this a little bit. And so they really actually had gone over some testing, and I'm going to throw, I'll figure out how to put this PDF and get it out to you guys so that you can see the same information. If you have questions, you can ask me about it. But people have been asking more, about the antibody testing, and the Infectious Disease Society of America has talked about it a little bit, and there's a link here that I'll put up so that you guys can look at as well at your leisure, or not if you don't want to. But one thing I want to highlight, and that they've kind of highlighted in here that I think is really pertinent, is when we're talking about testing right now, and we've talked about sensitivity and specificity, whether we're getting false positives or false negatives with tests. And that is still an issue, and primarily that is a really big issue for us, because right here, if you can see my little cursor here, when the prevalence, and that's something we call the pre-test probability, like how likely are you to have some infection that I think you have? Like if you come in here for an evaluation for, because you have sore throat, if you have a headache or a stomach ache, or you have little red spots on the, what we call the soft palate, the top of your mouth in the back, I would say, that seems really suspicious for strep. So you have a high pre-test probability. If you're like, I think I have strep, Dr. Jill, and you have a runny nose and a cough, and you're sneezing, and maybe you have an earache and all of these things, those things actually lower the pre-test probability, because often we know strep has, this sore throat and not a lot of these other symptoms. But as you know, it's not black and white, so that's not always the case. But so with this right now, when we have a prevalence or a pretest probability of less than 5%, we don't have a lot of this virus in our state from what we can tell. A test with a specificity of even 96 to 98%, so that's pretty good. It's not 100, but it's pretty high. It's more likely to give a false positive result than a true positive result. And the interesting thing, because the prevalence of people having a prior SARS-CoV-2 infection is, they're estimating at less than 1% in the Alaska population in general. So that's why the concern is that we may get lots of false positives. The other issue that we've talked about before is if, these tests are sensitive, that they're not actually picking up past common coronaviruses. There's 4 circulating strains right now, and we've all been infected with coronavirus at some point, maybe not, SARS-CoV-2. So that's the other thing. So when people ask me about testing, I don't think, given the amount of infection we're seeing in the state, we don't have great testing. So I hope that makes some sense. And then we can move on to some way more fun things. I I want to start with kind of immune support. And I told you that I had some updates. So there is a really cool paper that was just printed. I think I got this a week or so ago, which is really cool. And I will share a link to this for you guys. But I'll also warn you, it's it's intense. A couple cool things though is they've kind of really broken this down in a neat way to prevention, infection, escalating inflammation, because we know one of the problems with this COVID-19 is that it can just cause our immune system to go awry and kind of go crazy and be over exuberant, and that causes more issues. And then it talks about recovery phase. And so I'll talk to you again about and show you the updated handout that I shared with you a month ago from the Institute for Functional Medicine. And now it's updated with a few more things. So this is cool. The paper, if you try to read it, that's awesome. If you don't want to read it, that's my job. But it really, I think it's really nice if people are questioning, well, that doesn't work. How can that possibly work? This paper is really written in a very mechanistic way, really focused on kind of the pathophysiology of what happens from, the time, like, do we support that, we talked about that innate immune response. Do we have an adequate immune response to attack this right away? And then if we do get it, and once we start to attack it, do we, also have the other arm of our immune system to come in and start cleaning things out so that we don't have that over exuberant response? And so it's really written in a neat way that I think for anybody who questions nutrition, the role of, targeted nutraceuticals and supplements, it really doesn't give you a lot of room to argue like that there's no support, because there clearly is. And so I'll go through this on the other form too, but this breaks things down kind of foundationally again, additional support in terms of antioxidants, different things that support natural killer cells, which we talked about, supporting a Th1. We didn't really get into Th1 and Th2 immune responses. Th1 is generally a lot of our natural killer cells. And when I was first taught, we likened that to that innate or acute response, but we also know that there's some crossover now. Th2 response, and somebody who would have like a high Th2 response tends to have more of that antibody. And so people that have autoimmune disease and that kind of stuff tend to have a more robust Th2 response. So it talks a bit about that. And then also just anti-inflammatory support that we talked about. And then I won't kill you with the rest of this, but this gives an interesting figure. So if somebody gets an infection, this little orange part is kind of the viral titer. We want this very timely first response to fight the infection, and then you have a milder clinical course. If people don't have a real robust initial response, those are the people that we think are ending up with more extensive disease. So, and I think for most people that makes sense. And then another thing I wanted to, this figure 4 talks a little bit about like what are our levels of inflammation. So if somebody has chronic inflammation, we basically have these thresholds. And I've talked to everybody a little bit about thresholds when we talk about resiliency. If you have a lot of stress, it's just that one last thing that pushes you over, versus if we create more of that resiliency, whether it's in our mental health or in our nutrition, those things, we have more leeway before we hit that threshold. And that's what this really shows. If you have a baseline way down here, you got a long way to go until you hit that threshold. If you have high inflammation, high stress, those things, you have less room to move before you hit the threshold. And so that's really what this is talking about. And then there is another, and this one gets a little bit more deep in terms of you know, of specifics, I guess. But we talk about, we know some of the mechanisms of what's happening when people get COVID and get really sick. We see thrombosis, so we see clotting issues. Um, Lungs tend to fill up with all this mucus, so we know mucus viscosity is an issue, and then people get septic, and that's when we get either viruses, bacteria, and all of those chemicals that are trying to fight it are in our bloodstream, and so that's when people get really sick. But this, the focus of this, and if you look at it, I mean, it'll take you a while if you choose to look at it, but it just shows us, like, you know, if we have reactive oxidants in here, different things drive different things. So things, you know, if you start to get inflammation in your lungs, your reactive oxidation system is up. You have more chance of fibrosis. There's different things like that. And so this just kind of shows in a simple, very simplified way, and somewhat oversimplified, this kind of talks about how glutathione and N-acetylcysteine can help reduce those reactive I don't know why I'm having trouble with this word today, reactive oxygen yeah, let's just say ROS, like, I don't know why I can't say that today. But it also reduces inflammation in the lungs. And how, you know, how if we don't have adequate T cells and natural killer cells, how things will go awry too. So that's all I'll get into in this, but there's a lot of different things. And the study then goes on to say, like, what other things help us decrease TGFB, those kind of things. And so it's pretty cool in that regard. And then this will probably look a little bit more familiar to you, as this was one of the things that I shared before. This was the nutraceutical and botanical recommendations for patients. And so this, the curcumin and the quercetin, zinc, that N-acetylcysteine, the vitamin D, vitamin A, vitamin C. These were in the last handout that I provided. Melatonin, elderberry, PEA, green tea, and resveratrol were. What's been added now are beta-glucans. Beta-glucans are sugars, and they are found in cell walls of bacteria, fungi, yeast, algae, lichens, and then some sort of plants like oats and barley. But they're, as you can see, well, you can't see that well because I scrolled down too far, but basically it's anti-inflammatory, enhances your immune function, and also is supportive for basically upper respiratory tract, which is being targeted, really one of the targets of COVID. The other thing, they've now feel like there's enough data, and this really is correlated to the paper that I just kind of showed you guys. Medicinal mushrooms, we know that those enhance your immune system. They decrease viral growth as well. Chinese skullcap, another thing, and Chinese skullcap's been used. It's been one of the keys that's been used in China and in Asia, and especially in Chinese medicine. That's been one of the big things they've used, in addition to licorice root. And both of these, Chinese skullcap and licorice root, enhance your immune function. They decrease viral growth. And then they regulate lung-specific inflammation and injury. So really, really helpful. But so these things are new things that are on there, and they're continuing to kind of update this. And I think a lot of this came out of really the out of this paper. There is another thing that I can share with you. I think I can share this with you as well. And there's basically, there is a kind of a provider thing. And so for you guys, if you're interested, you can look at it. I think it gives you mechanisms of action of how things work. What does it really do? And they really talk about in here kind of strength of support for things, and really risk of harm. Like, okay, there's some strong evidence for this, and the risk of harm is really low. So those are the kind of things like I like to look at when I'm thinking about before I would recommend things to people. Like, clearly if the risk of harm is really high or is moderate, we really have to think about that risk benefit of whether something like that is helpful. Let's then so this also then it kind of goes through each of these things, and I will, if I can, share these with you. An important thing to note, and especially kind of with Chinese skullcap, these things have been used for a long time in traditional Chinese medicine, and one important thing is generally these things aren't used kind of as standalone things, and a lot of times they are used in combination and in formulations, and that kind of goes along with the idea of like getting a lot of our nutrients, if we can, out of foods, because we know, say, we can pick brassica family vegetables, and those are those sulforaphanes, which we know actually help in this case as well. But if we just try to isolate one maybe thing that we think is helpful, we don't necessarily always get the whole effect. And I think a lot of times when people say there's not a lot of data for nutrients and there's not a lot of data for food and all of these things, because sometimes when we try to isolate one key component of broccoli, which we know is really helpful, but we're missing, you're missing everything else that comes in broccoli. And so sometimes when those things are studied, when we try to pull out and separate out specific ingredients, like, it diminishes basically the benefit. And so it gets harder to study that. And I don't think that should diminish our focus on nutrition by any means. But when somebody says, oh, that doesn't matter as much, well, yeah, it is harder for us to study, because when we isolate things, maybe we're not getting the benefit of the whole thing. So that's, this is like my exciting, like immune information this week. And then let me show you also, I'm going to share with you a couple of informative things. One is here's a website that, actually not a website, there's an article that I just came across actually yesterday, and it's very cool. So it was written a while ago. You'll see at the bottom when we go through here that they actually have been updating this. So you could say, Jill, that was published on March 14th. I know that it was. But we'll see at the bottom that they're updating numbers. And so it's kind of interesting. So they talk about these history of pandemics, and they give, like, when did these things happen? And, we've had pandemics throughout history, but when did they happen, and what was the death toll of all of these things? And so they used like these little, apparently we're into little fuzzy looking blobs for pandemics, but that's okay. But being able to see the different pandemics over time, and clearly there are some of the things that they have to guesstimate on, because we may not have, great data from the Antonine plague of 165 to 180. We have to use some extrapolation there, but it really goes through all of these different things, which is really interesting. There's another talks about, so basically death toll, highest to lowest. Really the bubonic plague, 1347 to 1351 was really the highest, and it wiped out 30 to 50% of Europe's population. And then smallpox was a really big thing. And I, just through conversation with some friends last night, we figured out the the smallpox vaccine, we pretty much had eradicated it. And if you were born after 72, you didn't get a smallpox vaccine. If you were born before 72, you have the honor of having that little circular thing on your shoulder, like, and that was our smallpox vaccine. So that's pretty neat. But that is one of those things that at this point, the only place smallpox is, or theoretically should be, is in a lab somewhere. But this is really kind of cool in terms of just explaining again the impact. You know, smallpox killed an estimated 90% of Native Americans, and like 400,000 people were being killed annually. And then we got the vaccine, and that was the first ever vaccine that we'd developed. So that's really it's really interesting and significant. So we know that vaccines definitely can play a huge role in things, and the question will be how much will a vaccine play a big role for this current thing. But you know, it goes through HIV and AIDS has been really impactful, and I think sometimes we forget about the impact of that because it was really big, you know, in the 80s, and I think people talk maybe less about it, and it you know, and clearly it's still there right now. COVID, and here's where they're updating it, which is really cool. You know, right now 293.5 thousand people have died. So you can kind of see what happens. And SARS and MERS were the other coronaviruses that have happened previously. So, and then this one this is just another way to look at each of these graphs, and it talks about, you know, what kind of where did it come from, what kind of an infection is it a virus, was it a bacteria, those kind of things. So this is really cool, and I will share this link as well. In terms of you know, we hear a little bit about tracking this infectiousness, and we've heard a lot about this R naught, that reproduction number, and like what is the likelihood, how many people do we spread it to. So MERS had an R naught of 0.8. The flu generally is 1.5. Ebola was 2. COVID-19, as of right now, they keep altering this. It looks to be 2.5. SARS was higher. Mumps was 4.5. Rubella, most of this is something that gets vaccinated. Again, we haven't seen rubella in quite some time. Smallpox is 6. Measles is 16. So you can see, like, measles is really virulent, if you will. So that's kind of interesting stuff, and that's this cool article that I came across that I thought was really fun and informative to read. So I'll put a link to that in the next message that I sent you guys in terms of a newsletter. And then let's go. So let's go to exercise. This I just came across some really cool things that I want to be able to share with you guys. And so I just want to go run through the PDFs with you. So in terms of monitoring aerobic intensity, and you know, we talked about how it should be 150 minutes of moderate activity at a minimum. It could be 75 minutes of vigorous activity, and you're like, well, I don't know what that means. So, you know, certainly there are, you know, most of you know I wear like a watch that has a heart rate monitor, and so I know what my heart rate zones are, and those are things that we can calculate. In this, in here, it just gives you a variety of ways to know, like, what kind of intensity am I at. You know, one simple way is talking. If you can talk and hold a steady conversation, if you're walking with someone, that's pretty aerobic activity. If you get to the point where it's harder to speak, you're definitely getting up into more vigorous activity. Heart rate, it gives some breakdowns, and you can do, there is target heart rate is 220 minus age, and then you can say, you know, if you want to be at a moderate intensity, you would multiply that by 65 to 75%. If you want to be vigorous, it's 76 to 90%. I can tell you right now, my max heart rate by this estimation is, I have to think about this, 17. This would say like my max heart rate's 168. I can tell you guys like, or actually as a target heart rate, that'd be pretty vigorous for me. So, and that's interesting. They used to say that this is kind of your max heart rate, and that would be low for me. Another thing is you can just go for like a perceived effort, you know, that 1 to 10 graded scale, you know, like resting hopefully isn't a lot of effort. It should be a 0, you know, versus, you know, if you get up to 5, that gets pretty hard. 7 is very hard. 10 is like, this is all I've got, you know, so that would be like your flat out sprint at the end of a race, if you will. Certainly, there is another way to look at this in terms of motion sensors, and this is a bit new to me to think about it this way, and maybe I'll mess with this a little bit, but it talks about how vigorous activity is more than 100 steps per minute. So I think that is pretty neat. The other, a couple other things that I have, there's a whole little PDF that talks about high intensity training. Excuse me. No, I'm not sick. I just have a scratchy throat. High intensity interval training. I've talked about this with a lot of you, and just talking about how you can, even if you're out walking, you can pick it up a little bit. This just goes into a little bit more depth about this. How many times can you do it? Why is it popular? These kind of things. And it's, I think it's just good information. And so if people are interested in that, that is really reasonable. Some more support for resistance training, which you guys know I'm a big fan of the Key 3. If you heard the radio show on Monday morning at 7:30 on Big Cabbage Radio, we talked again about exercise and doing squats, how the Key 3 really is a squat. It's a chest press this way. So if you were doing a push-up, that's going to be a chest press. And then a single arm row, which maybe I can back up enough, you know, that's bending over and lifting up. So those are really simple things that we can do in terms of resistance training, but this talks about the, you know, the physiologic benefits of that. And then the other thing, which I've known about for quite some time, actually did it again this morning because I think it's easy to do. And there's something called the 7-minute, and like my watch, basically I have an app downloaded onto my watch where it counts, it gives me 30-second intervals and 10 seconds in between. So what this looks like, the 7-minute workout, and there's a variety. I mean, you can find this in an app. You can do this with a timer. So basically you start with you just do jumping jacks for 30 seconds. And you get a 10-second break, and then you do a wall sit. This is kind of like your squats, 10 seconds. Then you do push-ups for 30 seconds. Crunches, step up onto a chair or a step, squats, tricep dips, planks, high knees, and then you do lunges, push-ups, and you do that you kind of do a push-up and then rotate up to your side. So you do that for 30 seconds, and then you do side planks for 30 seconds. And so it's super simple. And it really, it's really effective actually in 7 minutes a day. So, and clearly we can modify these things as to what you can do and can't do. So it's just a cool, simple exercise that you can do. And then lastly, one of the things that I also came across is the Center for Mind-Body Medicine. I listened to Dr. James Gordon speak probably 7 or 8 years ago, and he is just a super cool guy. He's a psychiatrist, and I really had admired him and was really drawn to him just from his standpoint of he just, his medicines aren't a go-to for him when it comes to mental health. And so that resonated with me, as you can imagine. And he really, you know, he came out of the era, he graduated from medical school, actually, I kind of think the year I was born. So he's, uh, he's significantly older than I am, that's for sure. But he, you know, he was in that time period where they did electroconvulsive therapy and where drugs were new and all of that stuff. So I just feel like he has just this track record. Um, and what he's really gravitated to is really mind-body medicine. And so I'll put the link in for this. They basically on there, the Center for Mind-Body Medicine has basically a coronavirus page, and you can register. This is free. And the cool thing is they have all these webinars, you know, like reducing stress and restoring hope, mobilizing the healing power of the mind, befriending your body, eating wisely and well, the wisdom of, you know, your body, only connect. And you can register for a thing calling, you know, honor your emotions. And so it's really neat. And I just thought that this was a super cool resource for people. And I have found him really helpful. He's written a lot of different books over the years, and the Center for Mind-Body Medicine does a lot of different trainings in terms of mental health, but nutrition, and really kind of mind-body, which we all know is really kind of the linchpin of our health, really, at this point. So those are, I think those are most of the things that I wanted to cover with you guys. So let's see if, I think there was a flash that there were maybe some more comments. Excellent. So I will share another thing that Sam, you can see in the chat box, has shared with us, and there is kind of a nitric oxide flush exercise that you can do. And if I recall, it only takes a few minutes to do this exercise. And interestingly, having increased nitric oxide, you can also increase that by humming as well. And this would actually increase your nitric oxide. Question, how helpful are cloth masks? I think that is about $1 million question right now. I think, you know, clearly if any of us are sick, clearly we know cloth masks, or even surgical masks. The question is does that really protect you or protect the world from you? You know, probably more protecting the world from you. And so for us, like breathing through cloth masks, you know, if you were close enough to somebody to get a respiratory droplet, yeah, it will help from that standpoint and will decrease that transmission. Right now, the recommendation is to wear cloth masks in the office. If you come in, we ask that you wear a cloth mask. That is what is being mandated right now to us. I will wear a surgical mask when I see you. If you're getting blood drawn, Salito will wear a surgical mask as well. So I think it's tough. Like I just read I've read articles just like you all have, that cloth masks aren't helpful. And then you know, I just read another thing, an opinion paper, I think in the New York Times, by Marty Makary, somebody who I think he's a surgeon, has written the book that I talked to you guys, I think at some point, or mentioned before, The Price We Pay. And it's a really good look at our healthcare system or medical care system. He, you know, was advocating masks. And so, you know, I think it's all over the board, but right now the mandate is that people wear masks. So I think we wear masks right now. Oh, good question. You know, going back to basically our exercise intensity, I think if you are walking, vigorously walking up a hill, I mean, I think that that's probably pretty good. If you're a data person, that kind of stuff, you could clearly you could check your pulse and those kind of things. But I think, you know, like I would say, like if it's use that perceived exertion scale. Like I think that that is super helpful because you can, I mean, we all know, like if you know, if you're walking enough that it's hard and effortful, or if it seems pretty easy. So I mean, I think using a scale, I don't think it's not required to monitor your heart rate. I mean, there's certainly I find, you know, heart rate gets used a lot in training, but really that's when we're really working on exercise prescription, and maybe you have a goal, uh, and you know, an endpoint like a race or something, so that we know that you're training at these appropriate intensities, and that's when really heart rate. And then we'll even get into sometimes, especially with bicycles, we're talking wattage and all of those things and power. And so I think really using a perceived exertion scale is really good. Um, and I think that that's helpful. Uh, I apparently can talk most of the time, and even if my heart rate is in a higher zone, somehow apparently I can still talk. Um, so talking is, I think that's a good thing, but certainly if you're really doing something vigorously, you know, talking is harder. Any other questions? Maybe, maybe not. Let's get back to, here we go. So yeah, if those are the questions today, I will work on getting all of these resources linked out to you guys, and that way you can muddle through things. If you have questions, as always, please let me know. Happy to try and answer questions. And it looks like it's going to be another beautiful day, so please go outside and enjoy it. And if that's all, everybody have a good week. We'll stick with the same time next week as well. And I don't have a lot of other updates right now in terms of like the state, other than we seem like we're doing okay. Things are opening up a little bit. So, you know, really like the biggest things we can do for ourselves is make sure we're getting sleep, don't eat a bunch of junk, make sure you're staying really hydrated, and get outside each day. Like those are the things that we've got to do. The virus is going to be here. Viruses are going to be around us forever. You know, that is just the reality of things. So really, what can we do to strengthen ourselves so that so that we don't have to like rehash these kind of things, you know, like we can all become susceptible. We've dealt with the flu for a long time, and like hopefully eventually this is where this gets us to as well. So let's do what we can to strengthen our own immune systems and kind of push that threshold for each of us up higher. So, all right, guys, have an awesome week. We'll stick with the same time again next week, and always let me know if you have questions, okay? All right. Thank you, guys.